So, now that we've done that, you're probably asking yourself, hey, Letty McHugh, how come you're all up on the Dow Instagram feed trying to make me make an origami boat? Well, the answer is that for my ongoing project that Dow have been supporting, Seaworthy Vessel, I am working on folding an installation of 1,000 origami boats. And now I've said that, you are probably asking yourself, hey, Letty McHugh, why on earth are you folding 1,000 origami boats? And to be honest, that's a question I ask myself quite often. To answer it, I'm just going to go back in time a little bit and tell you where the project Seaworthy Vessel came from and some of the inspiration behind it. So I first had the idea for Seaworthy Vessel back in 2015 when I was on a train and I looked out of the train window and there was a scrapyard, and in that scrapyard was a line of like massive anchors that had obviously come off ships. And on that day when I saw those anchors, I sort of started to think about what had happened to the ships that the anchors came off and what had led to them being scrapped. And I just remember this sentence coming into my head of, well, they were scrapped because they weren't seaworthy. And although the project changed a lot, that day that thought came into my head. And then the next question of what would happen if that notion of seaworthiness or unseaworthiness, so you're seaworthy, you're a ship in the sea, you're unseaworthy, you're a collection of parts in a scrapyard, what would happen if that idea was applied to people? And, you know, there's obviously a lot of contentious questions around the idea of worthiness with people, like who we consider worthy. And I particularly thought about my great-grandfather, or Grandad Billy, as he was known to me. I think, so my great-granddad was in the Merchant Navy. That's how I came to know the little that I do know about seafaring and about ideas of seaworthiness. I think when I tell people that my project is inspired by my great-granddad, I think they assume that it's like family research that I'm doing about somebody that's dead, but and he is dead now, but for most of my life, until I was 16, he was alive and he was a big part of my life. And the stories of his that I know, they're all first-hand stories that he told to me. And the sort of connection that came was that he was in the Merchant Navy in the Second World War, and he was in an industrial accident that really badly affected his hands. Both hands were really badly damaged. He lost fingers on one hand, and he was discharged from the Navy, the Merchant Navy, and the certificate, the discharge certificate that I actually have, the phrasing on it is reason for discharge, physically unfit for seafaring. So I sort of knew that people could be considered, you know, unfit for sea work or unseaworthy, I guess. And I think at the time when I was first thinking about this project, I had still quite recently been diagnosed with MS. So that relation in my mind of like questioning my own place as an artist and my artistic career and my place in the world as a sort of newly disabled person or a newly diagnosed disabled person was definitely in my thinking when I was first thinking of this project. And I think I was really thinking of the thing that really struck me was boats as the metaphor for people, because I think if you think about, you know, a small ship in the massive ocean, that really related to me as like tiny people in a large, indifferent universe where we're constantly beset with circumstances beyond our control. And then that's where I think the idea for seaworthiness in people came from, is the idea that in order to weather those circumstances beyond our control in the way that ships weather unexpected weather at sea, the thing we need is resilience, you know, emotional resilience, is that feeling of buoyancy. So that's what I was thinking about when I first started thinking about working on the project. And I was really, in particular, thinking about one story from my great-grandfather's life, which was that when he did have that accident and he was discharged from the Merchant Navy, and he was unable to work for 3 years due to his hand injuries. One of the things that he did to rehabilitate his hands was that he learnt to knit, and he knit slippers for all his family. And my grandma and my auntie Gina always talk about these stories of these like lumpy, uncomfortable but made with love slippers that there were just dozens of as he was learning to use his hands again. So one of the ideas that I had for the project was that I wanted to do a similarly sort of intensive, repetitive task as one of the artistic outputs. Originally, I was thinking about knitting slippers myself, like a large number of slippers, but I sort of both decided that that was a bit literal, and that I'm really rubbish at knitting, and it would have taken forever, and not been very good. But I was thinking about some really intensive, repetitive physical activity that I could do as part of understanding that process that my granddad went through. So just as I was wanting to start work on the project, in sort of maybe 2016 time, as I'd kind of developed the idea, almost poetically, I had an MS relapse that really affected my hands. So then I couldn't work, and I think I didn't understand until it happened, like, what an emotional experience that would be for me as an artist, having something that affected my hands that I'd come to rely on so much, you know, for making work, and it felt like a loss of a voice in a way, because I use my hands so much in creative expression. So when I came back to work on the project again, when I was getting back to work, that was really where the idea of making a large-scale origami installation became even more important, I think, to the project, because it was both sort of repeating this repetitive action that my granddad Billy had undertaken, but also it became about me sort of wanting to test my own hands and my own, you know, I'd had origami skills before I started working on this project, and my confidence in those skills had been really undermined by this relapse. So it became about me physically reinforcing those skills and exploring those skills again, but also that sort of emotional journey of learning to trust my hands again, and working with my hands again in a really sort of fiddly, intensive way became a really important part of the project. And I think the idea of making 1,000 became like, it's like such an undeniable statement of, the massive achievement of being able to do that with my hands again. So that was the idea when I started making origami boats at the start of 2019. Was really exploring this thing with my hands and that relationship with my granddad, and kind of the wider thing of worthiness. But the project really developed to be about a lot more than that, I think, especially after. So in early 2019, I was very lucky to receive an emergence bursary, in part supported by Disability Arts Online. Receiving the emergence bursary really changed the development of Seaworthy Wrestle as a project and my development as an artist, I think, and the support and input I got from the organisations that I was working with was so important to that development. I think the most important thing that it allowed me to do was that I was able to take an artistic research trip to Oslo in Norway. That was really important to the project for two reasons. One is that Oslo is where my granddad really was when World War II broke out. And there was a lot of, it's like a really important story in my family because it was my grandma, his daughter, was born the day before war broke out, and then they couldn't get in contact with Grandad Billy because he was stuck in Oslo and they didn't really know what was going to happen and like whether it would be safe for them to sail home. But it was also the only place that he ever went back to of all the places. He used to joke that he'd sailed around half the world twice. He'd done a lot of travelling in the Merchant Navy, and Norway and Oslo and Bergen were the only places that he ever wanted to return to. So it felt to me like it was really important when I was sort of trying to understand this relationship between my experiences and his experiences. It felt like a really important part. It felt like a really important place to go. And I think the experience of going there, of going to what was the docks in the 1930s and 40s when my granddad was sailing back and forth there, just that connection, that real moment of, separated by time but like standing in the same place, and those like big feelings that I had in that place felt like a really important part of developing the story, and sort of, I think in part of my motivation for the project now I look back was because there was questions that I wanted to ask my granddad Billy that I couldn't ask because he's dead, and part of the exploration of the project was about trying to understand what was it like in Oslo, like what was that draw that he felt. And having been there, I think that I get it. There's something about Oslo that is just a really beautiful and calming place where I think you are really constantly overwhelmed by the outstanding beauty of the fjords. It's a good place to think. I have not sailed around half the world twice. I haven't been to very many places, but Oslo is definitely somewhere that I would go back to if I could. And I think the other thing that was really important for me and the development of Seaworthy Vessel in the project, about that trip to Oslo, was that I learned a lot about ships while I was there that I did not previously know. There's a lot of maritime history, and I went to see the Viking longships that are in Oslo, which are the, I believe, the most intact Viking longships that are on display anywhere. And I found the experience of seeing them like really overwhelming, but also weirdly like a hopeful experience. I think there was something about seeing them and realizing how like relatively fragile they are, but they've survived, 1,000 years, and thinking about the weirdness of that as a human endeavor, that we would ever have looked at like something as huge as the sea, as like the fjords going out to the sea. We looked at that and we thought, well, I reckon I could build a boat and sail across that. Like, that just seems like the most unlikely thing. And I think those Viking longships really brought home to me sort of the wonderful, ridiculous, like the ridiculous nature of the human spirit throughout, the ages. The idea that we would think that we could sail a sea, or pronounce the word ridiculous. And I think just that feeling of the fact that they had still survived, through all the most unlikely outcomes for that boat, to be still stood there in 2019 with me, like an artist who grew up in Keighley, looking at it, really made me think about the inherent hopefulness and sort of hopefulness in spite of massive adversity that is an essential part of both sailing and being a human. And then the other really important thing was that I went to the Oslo Maritime Museum and read all these remarkable stories about ships that would sink and then be refloated and go on to sail for like another 30 years. And there was all these stories about ships in the harbour. And it's when I sort of came to learn that I had fundamentally misunderstood something about this idea of seaworthiness when I started the project, which is that I think when I first thought about seaworthiness, when I was looking at those anchors in a scrapyard, I thought of seaworthy and unseaworthy as having like a really clear dividing line, and it being a permanent state once a ship became unseaworthiness. But that's not the reality. The reality is that, ships can become unseaworthy, but then they can be repaired or they can be refloated and they can be seaworthy again. And it's the same for people, and maybe more pertinently in my personal journey, it's the same for me, that we can have experiences that make us feel broken, and maybe we falter in the progress that we're trying to make, but we can overcome that and we can be whole again. Or we can keep going in spite of adversity, and we can overcome things. And that the human spirit is, I think, inherently buoyant. And that was a really important lesson that I learned in part through my experiences of spending that time in Oslo. I actually wrote about this a lot in the companion book for Seaworthy Vessel, which is called Some Days I Am the Sea. And I don't say this a lot, but I'm really proud of that book. You can download it for free on my website if you feel like giving it a read. It really talks in more details about all the stories behind the project and the kind of the process that I went through. I think it's quite an important part of the project if you fancy giving it a read. I hope you do. I also really hope that you feel like getting involved and folding some origami boats of your own. I think that maybe this will help you understand the idea of the project, about how we can overcome things, and we can take pride in ourselves, and we can celebrate our achievements, and maybe think about what your own personal thing is that nobody else is going to be able to read on your piece of paper that you make a boat out of. And I hope that you'll share it with the hashtag Seaworthy Vessel. I really hope that together we can build quite a sizable online fleet. That's the final thing that I have to tell you about this project, is that the original plan for these workshops was to do it in person, but obviously, you know, the old pandemic happened. But I think after everything that I'd learned from the project, I had to find a way to adapt it, because that's the whole point, right? Is that people are adaptable and that we find ways round things. We stay afloat. So that's what I hope this project can do. I guess I just want to finish by saying what the future of the project is. I'm still hoping to eventually show the full physical fleet in a real life gallery somewhere one day. I'm really hopeful that that's going to happen, and that maybe I'll be able to do some in real life workshops at some point. I'm also planning to do another live stream when I've got 10 or 20 boats to go. But until then, thanks for taking part in the project, and thanks for watching.